if you remember last week, we were talking about Isaiah. I'm sorry, my brain is all over the place with names today. We were talking about Isaac and how Isaac raised his family, and we just barely skipped in. We touched on the surface of him having Esau and Jacob. So we're going to jump back to that into chapter 25. We're just going to do a little bit of chapter 25, and then we're going to jump back into chapter 27 and follow Jacob and Esau. Chapter 25, verse 24 says this. When her days, talking about Rebekah, when her days to give birth were completed, behold, there were twins in her womb. The first came out red, all his body like a hairy cloak. So they called him Esau. Remember, that's Elmo. We don't remember. Afterward, his brother came out with his hand holding Esau's heel. So his name was called Jacob. Isaac was 60 years old when she bore them. So it says that Jacob was literally holding on to the heel of Esau. If you've ever given birth to twins, you know that's not the case. They're usually not like right after each other like that. And yet this name seems to really represent Jacob. The name actually means heel grabber. That's his name, heel grabber. So if you're named Jacob, I'm sorry. But right, it's heel grabber. And that actually goes on, not in the literal sense, but metaphorically to be translated throughout different places to be deceiver and schemer. Because it's this idea that someone always kind of working off of the benefit of another. Not ever just making their own way, but scheming to use other people to advance themselves. And quite frankly, Jacob lives up to that name. And we're going to see that throughout this story. Verse 27 says, when the boys grew up, Esau was a skillful hunter, a man of the field, while Jacob was a quiet man, dwelling in tents. Isaac loved Esau because he ate of his game, but Rebekah loved Jacob. Let's stop there for a minute. So Esau is dad's pride and joy, right? Esau's a hunter. Esau's the outdoorsman. My guess is Esau could probably throw a football pretty good. Esau's captain of the football team, right? And so he's kind of dad's the apple of dad's eye. Dad's super proud of Esau, and he shows it. Jacob isn't favored by dad. Jacob probably gets a lot of, why can't you be more like your brother? And maybe even it's not said so much, but it's felt. It's sensed. That dad really wishes he had two Esau's. And he tolerates a Jacob. Maybe some of you grew up feeling that way as guys. Just whatever it took, you wanted to please your dad. But you just knew that you never measured up. You never became what he wanted you to become. That's a tough feeling, and it's hard to get over. I read Johnny Cash's biography. And if you know much about Johnny Cash, he had an older brother that was killed in a sawmill accident when they were boys. And Johnny's dad used to repeatedly tell him, the wrong son died. Can you imagine wanting to live up to that your whole life? That the wrong son died. I'm never going to be what you want. What you wanted, what was going to make you happy is gone. And he also kind of blamed himself a little bit too because he wasn't there. He was supposed to be there and he wasn't there to help. And so he lived that his whole life with that. And a lot of us carry things from our very early childhood. We carry it all the way through life, trying to earn something that we're never going to earn. And Jacob doesn't realize until later on in his life that his fulfillment, his being all that he can be, didn't come from pleasing his dad. It came from pleasing his heavenly Father. And the earlier we can realize that in this life, the better it goes for us. So Jacob's, he's kind of more of a homebody, right? Jacob hangs out in the tents. I'm guessing his personality is a little bit more of a thinker. right? Jacob would rather read a book. Esau would probably take that book out and burn it in a field or use it for target practice, right? I mean, they're just two totally different kinds of people. But just because Jacob is the thinker doesn't mean he's wise. Do you know there's a big difference between wisdom and intelligence? I've known some really smart people that are not wise at all. They don't know how to use wisdom in their life. And Jacob's one of these people. He might be really smart, but he has no sense of wisdom. He has no sense of how to use that intelligence in a way to honor God and to follow after what God would call him to do. But as a result of this, mom ends up having a heart for Jacob. And so now we have this split home situation. And these boys, I'm imagining, play their parents off of each other, right? Jacob wants something. Who's he go to? Mom. Esau wants something. Who's he go to? Dad. And so the home becomes split based on their parents' inability to understand that God gave them children with different gifts, different personalities for a reason, and to learn how to love them in the way that God called them to love them. Some of you have young kids still at home, and I would encourage you, figure that out. I think we're lying to ourselves if we don't, at least in the back of our head, kind of acknowledge, yeah, no, this one kid, I kind of, I'm drawn to them a little bit more, right? They're easier for me to get along with. They're easier for me to understand. This one, not so much. But if you don't acknowledge that and then intentionally work at that and intentionally give that over to God and have God help you with that, there's a good chance your kids are going to pick up on it whether or not you're verbalizing anything. Verse 29. Once when Jacob was cooking stew, Esau came in from the field and he was exhausted. And Esau said to Jacob, "Let me eat some of that red stew, for I am exhausted." Therefore, his name was called Edom. Jacob said, "Sell me your birthright now." Esau said, "I'm about to die. Of what use is a birthright to me?" Jacob said, "Swear to me now." So he swore to him and sold his birthright to Jacob. Then Jacob gave Esau bread and lentil stew, and he ate and drank and rose and went his way. Thus, Esau despised his birthright. So that is like the most expensive bowl of soup in the history of the world right there. Right? I mean, it's hard for me not to put them right now as twin 16-year-old boys. I don't think Esau was going to die. I just think if you've raised 16-year-old boys, how many times do they walk in the door and like, "Oh my gosh, I'm going to die. I'm starving, right? I've got to eat now," right? And Esau seems like, if we look at Esau's life, he seems like the kind of guy he doesn't think about the future. He doesn't think about what's going to happen next. He doesn't think about the consequences of his decisions. He just lives by the now. And Jacob is a guy who takes full advantage of that. And so here's these brothers, right? And they're kind of always at war with one another. Like, I know your boys don't do that, but these boys, right? They're just always at war with one another. And Jacob takes advantage of it. He says, thus Esau despised his birthright. I think what that's basically saying is it's not like Esau hated that he didn't want the birthright. He basically didn't take the time to think through what he was doing. He didn't think it through. And he loses his birthright. Now, that birthright basically meant that Jacob was entitled to half the stuff. I mean, double the stuff when his dad dies. That's the birthright. The oldest son, by that culture, it's not necessarily something biblical. We'll talk about that later, right? Just because it's in the Bible doesn't mean it's biblical, right? Just because people practice certain things doesn't mean they're biblical, right? We don't have any Christians here that practice certain things that aren't biblical, do we? Oh, okay, everyone should raise your hand right then. So they just because they fell into that practice because of the culture around them, it wasn't biblical, but that was the way things worked. Oldest son gets twice as much, right? And so Jacob basically just bought for a bowl of soup that whole thing. Now, there's a good thing Esau was probably going to think, my dad's not going to go by that, but that's what happened. But right here we see Jacob's a schemer. right? He's thinking, how can I use his situation to my advantage? And we see that all throughout his life. Well, now we get to a point where Isaac's getting older, and he's blind. And he decides, even though he ends up living a long time after this, he decides, hey, I'm going to give Esau his blessing now as the oldest son. Blessing and birthright, two different things. Blessing is just the father would bless all the children, but also in that culture, generally the oldest son would get the bigger blessing, the more blessing. Okay, so he's going to give him his blessing. It's almost kind of like a speaking little prophetic words into their lives, right? So he tells Esau, hey, go hunt something for me and prepare us a good meal that you and I can sit and share a good meal, and I'm going to give you a blessing, right? Once they have this good father-son connecting moment. Well, Rebekah overhears this. And Rebekah loves Jacob. Rebekah wants Jacob to get the better blessing. So Rebekah chooses to deceive her husband and pulls Jacob aside. And look at verse 8. Well, here's what she tells Jacob. She says, now therefore, my son, obey my voice as I command you. Go to the flock and bring me 2 good young goats so that I may prepare from them delicious food for your father, such as he loves. And you shall bring it to your father to eat, so that he may bless you before he dies. But Jacob said to Rebekah, his mother, behold, my brother Esau is a hairy man, and I'm a smooth man. Right? He's not a smooth operator. He's just a smooth man. Okay. Verse 12, perhaps my father will feel me, and I shall seem to be mocking him and bring a curse upon myself and not a blessing. His mother said to him, let your curse be on me, my son. Only obey my voice and go bring them to me. So she basically helps Jacob. In fact, actually, she kind of is setting the stage here for Jacob, right? I mean, mom's to blame on this one as well. Setting the stage for Jacob to deceive his father. So they dress him in his brother's clothes. And I got to imagine, they smelt quite a bit like Esau at the time. And they put a little goat fur on some of the smoother areas that would still be exposed from after his clothes. And they send him in and hope for the best. Right? So once again, we see Jacob scheming. Jacob willing to do whatever it takes. Jacob willing to use to his benefit anything he can from other people. But most importantly, we see him trying to help God along with unrighteous behavior. Right? God's going to do what God's going to do. Right? God's going to bless when God's going to bless. But Jacob and Rebekah choose to participate in unrighteous behavior just as a way to, make sure it all works out. You ever been guilty of that? You ever been guilty of maybe just stretching something a little bit or pushing something a little too far or bending your integrity a little bit in order to make something work out instead of just trusting that God's going to make it work out? It's an easy thing to be tempted to do, isn't it? To say, hey, I'm just going to push this along a little bit, even though it's not necessarily exactly what God would want me to do, and get the benefits from it. And so often we get away with it, right? So often when you bend and when you show a lack of integrity and you don't hold up the character that God calls you to, you still get away with it. But do you get away with it, one, in your heart? Do you live with that? Do you start to believe more and more that's who you are? See, the enemy uses that stuff. When we show a lack of integrity, when we act opposite of how God would call us to act, guess what? Every single time we do that, the enemy uses that to reinforce, oh, you're not really a righteous person. You're not really someone who follows God. You're actually this person. And we start to believe more and more we're actually this person. And the more we allow ourselves to delve into behavior that is contrary to what God calls us to do, the more we actually become that person instead of growing more and more to become the person God calls us to be. And Jacob is definitely falling into this trap. Verse 18. So here he goes. He went into his father and said, "My father," he said, "here I am." "Who are you, my son?" Jacob said. I'm sorry. "Who are you, my son?" Jacob said to his father, "I am Esau, your firstborn. I have done as you told me. Now sit up and eat of my game, that your soul may bless me." But Isaac said to his son, "How is it that you have found it so quickly, my son?" He answered, "Because the Lord your God granted me success." Then Isaac said to Jacob, "Please come near, that I may feel you, my son, to know whether you are really my son Esau or not." So Jacob went near to Isaac, his father, who felt him and said, "The voice is Jacob's voice, but the hands are the hands of Esau." And he did not recognize him, because his hands were hairy like his brother Esau's hands. So he blessed him and said, "Are you really my son Esau?" He answered, "I am." Then he said, "Bring it near to me, that I may eat of my son's game and bless you." So he brought it near to him, and he ate. And he brought him wine, and he drank. Okay, let's stop here for a few things. First of all, when I used to read this story, I was like, how in the world how did he fool Isaac in this? My kids, if they're in here, they're going to laugh at me. The older I get, the easier I see how he confused them. I'm picturing, he's a pretty old man at this point, and he's blind, and I get to that point sometimes. I'm like, "Are you sure? I thought we talked about this, right?" And I'm like, nope, that didn't happen. And it's so easy to kind of get me off a little bit. And I'm thinking, man, in 25 years, that's going to be much easier to throw one over on me. So I can imagine this a little bit more the older I get. Now, but I want you to see this. Notice his answer when Isaac says, "How is it that you're coming so quick?" Verse 20. He says, "How is it that you have found it so quickly, my son?" Jacob answered, "Because the Lord your God granted me success." Jacob, at this point in his life, we don't see any indication that he is choosing to follow or believe God in any way. Even to the point he's still saying, "Your God." So, Isaac gives him the traditional father's blessing to the firstborn. But then Esau returns after Jacob has left, and he prepares a meal for his father, and he takes it into him. Isaac and Esau at this point both realize that Jacob has stolen the blessing. And Esau says in verse 36, he says, "Is he not rightly named Jacob? For he has cheated me these 2 times. He took away my birthright, and behold, now he has taken away my blessing." So Esau devises a plan to kill his brother. Look at verse 41. Now Esau hated Jacob because of the blessing with which his father had blessed him. And Esau said to himself, "The days of mourning for my father are approaching, and then I will kill my brother Jacob." So Jacob is getting himself into a hole with this behavior, with his lack of character, with his lack of integrity. He's digging a hole. But his mom, once again, kind of steps in, and she convinces Isaac that they need to send Jacob away to get a wife. So Jacob's going to have to flee from his brother so he won't be killed. And this all goes back to that comment I made. Remember, just because something is recorded in the Bible doesn't mean it's scriptural. This whole idea of birthright and blessing, you read through this a lot in the Old Testament, right? But remember, God didn't always work within those means. Unfortunately, here, Jacob gets it in a subversive way. But God didn't always honor that birthright and that blessing. God didn't say, oh, well, that's just because the way your culture does that. That's how we're going to do it, right? Look at David. David became king. David was the one with the biggest blessing. He was the youngest of many brothers, right? There's a few different situations where we see God totally works around that. That's just cultural standard that God doesn't have to fit in. If God was going to bless Jacob, he still would have blessed Jacob. It had nothing to do with this birthright and this blessing. Jacob gets himself in a hole and has to learn these things the hard way because he's unwilling to choose to wait on God. So as a result, now he's sent off to find a wife back to his home, with their hometown, basically the place where Abraham came from, and then the place that Abraham went and got Rebekah from to be a wife for Isaac. And so now Rebekah convinces Isaac, hey, we need to send Jacob away to go get a wife. But there's something interesting about this. If you remember, if you were here last week or a couple weeks ago when we talked about Abraham sending a servant to go get Isaac's wife, Rebekah, Abraham sent a servant to get Isaac's wife. He sent a servant with this big dowry that he gets to go in and go, hey, here's all this money, and if you'll give your daughter as a bride for my master's son. And so goes and gets that. Isaac just has to sit around and wait, right? That's not the case with Jacob. Jacob, because of the situation he's gotten in, he could have had a pretty easy situation, but because of the situation he's gotten in, he's going to now put himself in a situation of 20 years of hard knocks because he couldn't wait on God because he tries to make it happen. So now he's sent out, says with really nothing but his staff. He doesn't have an entourage with him. He doesn't have a big dowry to go and offer to get a wife. So he's going to have to figure that out. We'll talk more about that next week. But verse 10, while he's on this trip, let's jump down to verse 10. It says, Jacob left Beersheba and went towards Haran. And he came to a certain place and stayed there that night because the sun had set. Taking one of the stones of the place, he put it under his head and he lay down in that place to sleep. And he dreamed. And behold, there was a ladder set up on the earth, and the top of it reached to heaven. And behold, the angels of God were ascending and descending. And behold, the Lord stood above it and said, I am the Lord, the God of Abraham, your father, and the God of Isaac. The land on which you lie, I will give to you and your offspring. Your offspring shall be like the dust of the earth, and you shall spread abroad to the west and to the east, to the north and to the south. And in you and your offspring shall all the families of the earth be blessed. Behold, I am with you and will keep you wherever you go and will bring you back to this land. For I will not leave you until I have done what I have promised you because you have been so righteous and trustworthy. Does it say that? No. Doesn't say anything about that part, right? Has nothing to do with Jacob's trustworthiness or his righteousness. It has to do with God's promise. Verse 16. Then Jacob awoke from his sleep and said, surely the Lord is in this place, and I did not know it. And he was afraid and said, how awesome is this place? This is none other than the house of God, and this is the gate of heaven. So early in the morning, Jacob took the stone that he had put under his head, and he set it up for a pillar and poured oil on top of it. He called the name of that place Bethel, but the name of the city was Luz at first. Then Jacob made a vow, saying, if God will be with me and will keep me in this way that I go, and will give me bread to eat and clothing to wear, so that I can come home again to my father's house in peace, then the Lord shall be my God. And this stone, which I have set up for a pillar, shall be God's house. And all that you give me, I will give you a tenth to you. So God appears to Jacob in a very powerful way. Remember last week, if you were here, we talked a little bit about how God appeared in the Old Testament versus how God works now. If you weren't here and you want to know more about that, you can listen to that one. He takes this time in appearing to Jacob to remind him of his provision and promise for his family through the bloodline of Abraham. And he promises that he is with them and he will bless them and he will keep him wherever he goes. And that he will bring him back to his homeland and will not leave him. So then look, how does Jacob respond? Right? How awesome is this place? This is the house of God. He is super excited. He recognizes fully 100% this is God. So it's easy right now as we're reading the story, right, to think, oh, great, he's fine. He's got it. He's got it. He understands. He finally gets it. And then you get to verse 20. Then Jacob made a vow. He's making a vow. This is a good thing, right? Saying, if God does everything I want God to do, if God gives me a good job, makes my family healthy, gives me no problems in this life, I'll acknowledge God. See, that's not a vow. I just went to a wedding yesterday. They had beautiful vows they shared. And I was thinking about this passage. And I was trying to think, what if one of them gave these huge promises for the future and said all the ways that they wanted to show love to the other one. And then the other one started their vows with, hey, if you do that stuff, hey man, then you got me. Right? That's not a vow. That's not a vow. He doesn't get it. God, he 100% acknowledges this is God. He builds an altar. This isn't like, well, I feel like God's calling. No, he builds an altar saying, this is God's house. This is the gate of heaven, this very spot. And yet he doesn't acknowledge God enough to say, God, I'm yours. I'll do whatever it takes. No, it's God, if you do everything I want you to do, if you come through for me, if you make me happy, then you'll get what I believe I owe you. And unfortunately, a lot of people deal with God that way. A lot of people deal with God like that. God, if you make my life what I want it to be, then I'm with you. But man, the moment I go through some hardships, the moment I go through periods and years even, maybe of struggle, man, I'm not going to work through that. And we don't trust God through it. But man, I have seen some people in their lives who have been faithful and trust God through decades of struggle at times to come out experiencing amazing blessings that they would have never guessed because they stayed faithful. They kept hope. I always go back to my grandmother on my mom's side. My grandmother on my mom's side lost 3 of her 4 sons before she went away to be with the Lord. One of them at the age of 4, another at the age of like 22, and then another at 40 something. She lost her first husband in their late 50s, and she lost her second husband before she went. My mom was a drug addict her whole life and died before her as well. She never would have been out of what would have been called just barely out of the lower class income in America. Never had any real skills to work, so she went to work when her husband died and just worked retail and doing little things, coffee shops, that kind of thing, her whole life. And yet gave praise to Jesus more than anyone I've ever known. And was filled with joy more than almost anyone I've ever known. And saw that God was at work. And it had nothing to do with, hey, God, you need to come through for me. Because she trusted. And here's the cool deal, you guys. Jacob didn't have this. You know what we have? You know what the good news of the whole good news of the gospel is? We already have the promise fulfilled. He's already done it for you. All you have to do is trust that Jesus died for your sins because you're not ever going to be able to make up what we owe God. And he paid the price. And because of that, we can have fulfillment. And God has come through already on his promises. See, God keeps his promise even when we don't. God keeps his promise even when we don't. I want to read 2 Timothy 2:13. It says this. It says, If we are faithless, he remains faithful, for he cannot deny himself. God cannot deny himself. Even when we're faithless, he is still faithful. See, God, some of God's promises have a clause, right? Don't just read every promise in the Bible and go, oh, that's a promise for me. Some of them are meant specifically for people. You got to read the promise in context. But the promises he has made for all his people, there's no clause. There's no if clause. So we have these promises we get to live in. Here's the deal. We get to choose if it's going to be easy or hard. Are we going to make it hard on ourselves, or are we going to make it easier on ourselves? We're going to see next week that Jacob now is going to go through 20 more years of making it really hard on himself. 20 more years of walking through the hardships. See, had he and his mom not tried to outsmart his dad and his brother and would have just waited on God, God still would have worked his plan, and it all would have been fulfilled. But no, he had to try to get ahead of God. He tried to rush his promises. I want to close with reading this passage. Proverbs 3, 5-8 says this. Trust in the Lord with all of your heart, and do not lean on your own understanding. In all of your ways acknowledge him, and he will make your path straight. See, when we trust in God, when we acknowledge him, he will make our path straight. He will take out so many of the hard knocks that we put on ourselves. But I love the word. I love 7 and 8. A lot of people stop at verse 6. But look at 7 and 8. Be not wise in your own eyes. Fear the Lord and turn away from evil. See, whose eyes was Jacob wise in? Not God's. He was wise in his own eyes. He was doing things the way he thought it should be done. And as a result, he didn't turn away from evil. And as a result, he didn't have a straight path. And look at verse 8. It will be healing to your flesh and refreshment to your bones. God will fulfill his promises in your life. And he will bless those who seek him. Question is, are you going to get those blessings the easy way or the hard way? There are some of you in here right now who have never made the decision to turn your life over to Christ and say, I'm just going to give it to you. And some of you in that situation won't. You're going to wait. You're going to keep waiting. And you're going to keep taking the knocks. You're going to keep taking the beatings. And that's okay. That's if that's how you want to live your life. That's the path you want to go down. No one can change it. Some of you know you need to trust God. You need to say, God, I'm just going to give it to you now. And I would encourage you during this song of decision to do that. We've got our prayer partners that are going to be in the corners. They would love to pray alongside you. They'd love to give you some resources. Some of you, you know the promises of God, and you've lived in the promises of God, but being honest right now, you're not walking in them. Being honest is right now, you feel like a pinball being bounced around life because you're doing it your way. You're not seeking what God has for you. Well, you're not seeking his word. You're not diving into what his plan is for your life. You're just living your life. You acknowledge him and you trust that he's there, but you're not leaning completely on his understanding. You're not acknowledging him in all of your ways. And you just need to recognize that. And you need to use this as an opportunity to just acknowledge that before him. And I would encourage you, maybe this is the time if you want to come up and take the communion elements and use a communion time to make that decision before him. Or maybe this is just a time for you to worship and thank God that he is a God that fulfills his promises. Let's pray. Father God, I thank you for the promises that you fulfill. God, I thank you for your mercy and your grace on us when we are hard on ourselves. When we start to believe the lies that we are the unrighteous person that can't ever allow you to take our life, and we just start doing it our way, and we stop trusting you. God, thank you that you are faithful, that you cannot deny yourself. God, I pray over anyone in here right now who is just sick of taking the beatings that they get from the decisions, the choices they make by leaning on their own understanding. God, I pray that they would just take that first step and say, I don't want to do this anymore. And they would seek to pray with someone before they go today. Pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen.